Awesome. So it looks like we're live now. Let me post this to the Gitter channel before we go live for reals. Awesome. So welcome to our February 7th community call. Today we have a lot of people from the core team and our architecture team. So we're super excited to get onto that. My name is Machiko, and I'm one of the community engineers here. And before we get started with today's deep dive topic on discussing the upcoming changes to our simple schema, we're going to do a very short 5 minutes or maybe even less update with Spencer about what's coming up, what the latest sprint on Reaction and what's coming up in Reaction 1.8. So, Spencer, how's it going?
It's going well. So last week we released 1.7, which had the first half of a fairly large ESLint rule set update. This week we are releasing 1.8, which will have the other half of that update. Both of these releases also have several other large refactors and performance updates. We're in the middle of a couple weeks worth of updates on just kind of general core Reaction, not really focused so much on features as improving the overall quality of what we have right now. So that's code quality, that's developer performance, how fast can you jump into the code base and start making contributions, understand what it is that you're looking at. That's, app performance, how long does it take for the app to restart? Eric, who you guys are going to meet in just a little bit, has done some pretty great work and pushing us in the right direction, helping all of us to know kind of where we should be spending our time to get the most results and the amount of time that we've had. And I think both of these releases are fairly significant for the amount of work that we put into them. Officially, they're not breaking changes, but in the release notes, I have noted potential places where if you have plugins that act a certain way, you may want to make sure that they're not breaking. We have not received any reports of 1.7 breaking anybody's release, and I don't anticipate anything with 1.8. But that is always a possibility, and so we do encourage you to test this with your own code and with your own databases before rolling it out in production. We also have a 2.0 release on the horizon. I think we've been talking about this for a little while. The code is approved. It's pretty much ready to go. So we're just kind of playing a game where I want to make sure we can get as much as possible into the 1.x branch before we go break everything. The 2.x branch, which is going to change our simple schema version, which is what Eric's here to talk about a little bit as well, will require some code rewrite. I think every single plugin that touches the schema will have to be rewritten in some form. And so we've been holding off on that a little bit, but I anticipate that release will happen within the next week or week and a half.
Awesome. So make sure you check in on the release notes, because that'll have more instructions about which ESLint rules we're turning on and things like that. So go back to there. So now I'd like to get into our deep dive section. So you may have seen his handle on GitHub or on Atmosphere on NPM, but we have a new engineer on our team who's been leading our team, Eric Dobberton. And if you check our agenda on Google Drive, I've linked, we have a blog post about him from, I think, almost 3 years ago now, because he's been 4 years ago, actually, because he's been involved in the project for a very long time, and now he's on Reaction full time. You might know him from his Meteor packages like Autoform, Collection 2, and Simple Schema, and today we're going to be talking about that one. And this has been a big PR. I think we've been working on it since maybe even December, but we're changing simple schema versions from the Atmosphere one to an NPM one. And he's going to be talking to us today about why we're making the change, what you're going to have to do to change on your app, and things that are coming up. So Eric, do you want to take over?
Yeah. Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, so as it was kind of said already, the 2.0 release will include Simple Schema 2.0, which is actually moving it from the Meteor Simple Schema package to the NPM package. And along with that came a lot of breaking changes. Maybe not a lot of breaking changes, but changes that affect a lot of places in a lot of schemas. So something to be aware of, and I'm going to go through all those. Was there any other general things you wanted me to answer before I just dive into what are the differences?
I think you could just dive in.
Okay.
But note that there are several NPM packages that have very similar names. So just when you're looking at this, just be careful you're looking at the right one.
But I just want to talk quickly about why we're making the change. What's the benefit?
Right. So other than just to update the package, which is always a good idea, the main benefit is to get all of the fixes and enhancements that have only been being made to the NPM package for the last year or so. So it will fix kind of a lot of random issues that you maybe weren't even aware were happening, where certain things in certain types of objects were not getting properly validated, or maybe were resulting in errors and shouldn't have, or things like that. And then it's just a little bit cleaner, more modern API in a few places. So it should just help with the understandability, especially around how do you extend schemas that are attached to collections, things like that, which I can talk about in a minute. And there are also some performance benefits that, like the auto value cleaning type stuff, was rewritten in the NPM version and is quite a bit faster on large objects. There was some specific testing related to that. So let me share my screen here and get into some more details about the changes. Yeah, so I've got a before and after here, of the left side being before, the right side being after. And so for importing it, that's the first difference you'll notice. If you're extending it or have your own plugin or something, instead of coming from the Meteor package, it comes from the NPM package, which is Simple Schema with no E, because with the E was taken. So that part's pretty straightforward. It's also the default import, so you don't need braces around that. So the first change to the schemas is that you can't use the array type shorthand anymore, where you would put the type within array brackets, and then that would sort of imply that it's an array type and that the items within it are a string. You now have to define both of them separately. So that's going to be probably one of the main things you'll see in your schema that you'll have to address, and it does throw an error if you don't address it, so you probably get a reminder there. Also, this decimal option was removed. So whereas before, for a float or a number that could have decimals, you would have number and decimal true, and now you would just have number, because that's the assumed behavior with numbers, is that they can be a float or have any number that basically is a number in JavaScript. And then the opposite case of that is if you had just number before without decimal, it was treated as it had to be an integer, and now it's more specific, more explicit, I should say, in the schema, so that there's this simple schema.integer type you can put there, which will just check to make sure that it doesn't have anything after a decimal point. So if we're extending schemas, it used to be that you could pass an array to simple schema and it would kind of combine those into a new schema while it was creating itself. And that does not work anymore. So you have to be more explicit about it, which it should be good because it's more clear what's happening. So this is kind of a similar example here of the left side moving to the right side here. You'd have some different definitions, and then you'd make a schema out of one of them and then call .extend and pass as many times as you want, extend and pass either overrides or new keys that weren't in the original schema. And and then still here on the right side, extend mutates the schema. So up here, after I call extend, this original schema is both of them. It doesn't, you don't get a new schema back. So if you don't want to do that, there's a clone you can use. And so you can do, you'd have your original schema and you do .clone. And this is an example of in the new 2.0 release, how package config extension is done. So you take, the basic package and then usually extend it with like some addition, like specific settings or something like that. So let's see, moving up here to validation changes. So these are just some name changes for getting errors. If you were calling invalid keys, you'd call validation errors. If you were calling add invalid keys, you'd call add validation errors. They're just a little more specific names. Validate one isn't there anymore. Instead, you could pass an array of keys to the normal validate. And all of these are, of course, on the simple schema change log on the meteor change log. If you look there, the cleaning changes. This is potentially one that could confuse people. Is before mutation was the default. So when you called this kind of pattern of cleaning and getting back an object, not only would you get back the cleaned object, but the original object would change as well to be clean. Meaning like it would have invalid keys removed or, things changed to the correct type, those kind of things that cleaning does. Now by default to, avoid confusion, it doesn't change the object, but you can get back the old behavior by just saying mutate true when you call it. In that case, you could still get the resulting object, but you wouldn't need to because the object you're passing in is mutated by reference. So for reactivity, it used to be that some of the functions were automatically reactive if you had them in like an auto run or in a template somewhere. The label key is invalid key error message. So those now can be reactive, but only if you pass in tracker to your schema, as is shown here. So you import it out of the Meteor tracker package and then just pass it in so that it knows how to make it reactive. And that's because NPM simple schema is intended to be used outside of Meteor. So if you want to inject Meteor features, you have to pass them in. The same thing with check here. It used to be that you could pass a schema to check and it would throw errors and kind of operate the same way that check package does. Now, in order to have it, so first of all, you don't have to use check. You could just call schema.validate. It does the same thing. It'll throw in an error as soon as it hits a validation error. But if you want it to satisfy the audit argument checks package, then you do have to inject the check object as an option when you make your simple schemas. So you'll see in the 2.0 release that we're injecting tracker and check to all of the schemas we're making. And then lastly, for collection 2, they're really, we didn't really change collection 2, but by virtue of the fact of using the new simple schema, there's one kind of change to that, which is it used to be that you could pass in an array of schemas or definitions to attach schema, and there were places in the core code that were doing that. You'd like pass in a schema and then some override options within an array. And since that was actually relying on the feature that I previously said went away, where you could pass an array to schemas, it's the same deal. You actually have to deal with it at the schema level ahead of time, by like cloning and extending it, and then just attach a single schema. And it's still true though that you can call attach schema multiple times and either replace them or like specify different selectors to have multiple schema support like we do on products. But those, you'll have to play around with that a little bit as far as how that works, but it should continue to work for whatever use cases. And a few more things on the new side here. The error messaging API is all different, so I didn't want to kind of get into that, but if you look at the docs, it should be clear. There's like just kind of name changes in a little bit different way it works. So if you have like specific errors that you're setting up that you wanted to see for specific validation or for specific keys, then you want to look at those docs. The internals are also different, the way that everything is stored after you instantiate a schema. So that means that you'll end up, if you're calling .schema to get like the object, or if you're using the internal ._schema object, those that whole structure is different. It doesn't move things into it doesn't move subschemas into this main schema, so you can't kind of traverse it the way you used to. You'll have to kind of play around with the different options there, or get in touch if you are using that for something. It also doesn't play very well with the previous Meteor package. So by that, I mean, you'll get strange errors, so if you see strange errors, basically one thing to check is that you're not pulling in both simple schemas for some reason. And that would happen if you have extended the app with some additional Meteor packages that themselves pull in the old Meteor simple schema, which you would have to then update those. Hopefully they have a version that uses npm simple schema, or you can replace them with a different package or just remove them. But yeah, it won't work. A few reaction specific tips related to schemas. What we think is going to be the way to extend now would just be to pull in whatever schema you want to extend and call .extend on it, assuming you want to either override or add some properties. And so there's an example of that here. That should, like I was saying, mutate the original schema everywhere it's used, and also mutate the schema that's attached to the collection, so that when the collection inserts and whatever are validated, it would get your changes. If you make a server method, validate any object against the schema for it if applicable, but don't import the schema directly. Instead, call .simple schema on the collection and pass the document. So like it's doing here. The reason to do that is because some collections have multiple schemas attached, and if you pass in the document into simple schema, it'll give you back with the one that's attached that applies to that document, because there's a selector usually. So even if you don't know that there's multiple, it's best to just always do this, because anybody could, at some point add a additional schema or add a selector or something, and then you'd want to make sure that you're getting that. And this takes the place of check, like I was saying before, as long as check is injected through the options into the schema that you're getting back. But the exception to the above is that if you're going to insert or update or do something that's going to validate already, then don't waste time doing 2 validations if you don't need to. So in this case here, there's an account insert here, and through collection 2 that would ought to already validate against the schema. So I wouldn't do this up here. Instead, I would just check to make sure it's an object, or maybe if you're going to use a couple other properties in this middle area, maybe you check those properties, check whatever you need to for the method, but rely on this to do the actual throwing from the simple schema validation. And that way you don't get to like, you don't have to go through it twice for a one that is valid. So that was my quick run through all the changes. I don't know if anybody on the call has anything that I need to clarify.
So I know we had one question on GitHub on this issue, but do we know if this is going to ship in 2.0 or 1.8, or when can people start to expect the changes?
Maybe it will not be in 1.8.
Okay.
This is the definition of 2.0. So This is all ready to go. We could ship it whenever, but because it kind of breaks all the way we do our schemas, this is 2.0.
I see. Yeah,
if
and
you
I know
have a
that
plugin that uses a schema, it's not going to work with Reaction 2.0 unless you make changes.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Yes, most likely.
Yeah, and we'll definitely have more kind of concrete documentation and guides for people leading up to it, and it won't just be covered in this YouTube video. So
yeah, and the documentation around schemas will be updated. So there'll be other ways to find this information.
Yeah. And
the pull request is 3331 if anybody wants to look at that.
Yeah, it's a pretty epic pull request, so that would be a good one to look at. Does anyone else have any more questions for Eric while we have him here on video?
Eric, what does this do towards the long-term goal of deprecating Meteor? Just to throw a bomb out there.
Well, it's one less Meteor package, so I feel like that's one of the primary things. Yeah, is just reducing the number of Meteor packages, and then this also allows us to the next thing is move all the auto forms out of there and replace them with a different React form solution, similar to what some of them have already been moved to. And so it'll just be an additional rolling removal of other packages, Meteor packages, that is.
So this was sort of a dependency step that we need to take in order to sort of finalize removal of AutoForm as a package, which is probably our most significant overall Meteor dependency, right? And allows us to finish going through all the admin settings and various forms that never got converted over to React and finalize the deprecation of Blaze and the move to a full React component library, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Just that. That's all.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah. And so that is of the next larger projects coming up, that is there's that removing AutoForm as well as removing the Meteor collection FS packages in favor of a non-Meteor file solution, which will be all that will be coming up really soon in other releases.
And I think maybe you or Spencer can also talk to this a little bit, but I think we also deprecated quite a few other Meteor dependencies in 1.7 and 1.8 as well, right?
Correct. Spencer might know more than me which ones it was, but
I'd have to look at the release notes, which I guess I can do. to know exactly which ones. So I'm pulling up 1.7.
Alerts.
Yes, S alert was deprecated. Looks like that's the only one in 1.7, and then I know 1.8 also has several Meteor packages. But as a team, we have been actively going through and trying to reduce the dependency on Meteor packages. That's a pretty straightforward goal we've got. So that's something we've been doing. I think we've also been reducing or been removing Meteor packages that tend to load large other libraries in a global manner. So a few of the packages out there we're removing like Moment.js and our transliteration libs, and we've removed some of the SMS stuff that only gets used in certain situations. We've moved those to dynamic loading modules. In the process of doing that, we've also noticed that there are other libs out there that are loading those things kind of into the global environment. And so, in order to actually see the gains from moving these to dynamically loading modules, we also need to remove or find some alternative for these larger packages that are pulling a lot of those in.
So an example would be AutoForm is pulling in Moment, and until we can get rid of Meteor AutoForm, then we're stuck with like two versions of Moment being compiled, right?
Yeah, I don't know exactly how, like if it's two different versions of Moment or if it's AutoForm ends up, pulling in a global and then all of our other packages end up just using that one. But yeah, we have more Moment than we would like to have.
For the moment.
For the moment.
Right.
Yeah. Thanks for that more kind of big picture roadmap update, Aaron. I'm not sure we had actually talked about that in the community calls, but there are a lot of changes coming, and we have a lot more cool stuff to talk about in our next community calls. It doesn't look like we have any questions from YouTube or Gitter. So
is everybody asleep?
Yeah. So as long as nobody else has questions, I think we can call the end. Any last question?
Probably just a statement for everybody that we do expect 2.0 timeline-wise in 2 weeks, 3 weeks,
or less.
Or less.
Yeah.
We may actually start with 2.0, right, and do
that's
stuff there.
Definitely a possibility. We could put 2.0 and layer on top of it. While it is a pretty major breaking change, I think most plugin authors, I know plugin's kind of a dirty word in terms of where we're going, but most people who are writing additional functionality for Reaction shouldn't have too much trouble following the guides that we're putting together. It's 2.0 because you can't just drop it in, but I think that shouldn't be too scary. Like, I don't want people to look at this and be like, well, I better keep my app on the 1.x branch. Please don't do that. It's not going to be worth it.
Yeah. That sounds good. And that's the last word. So maybe we'll have more updates for the next call, which will be in 2 weeks. So yeah, it's awesome.
Great.
See ya.
Right. Thank you, Machico.
Thanks.